In this video, you're going to learn 5 reasons why you should be training up young worship leaders in your church. Coming up. Hey everyone, Spencer here from leadingworshipwell.com, your daily dose of practical worship leading tips. If you want to find those tips, head over to Instagram or Facebook at leadingworshipwell, where I'm posting new tips every single day. So I'd love to connect with you there, but you're here on YouTube, so go ahead, hit the subscribe button down below so you don't miss out on future worship leader training videos just like this one. And let's get into it, because today we're talking about 5 reasons that you should be training up young worship leaders in your church. And I want to ask you, let me know in the comments below right now, are you training up young worship leaders in your church? Do you have a system to train up young worship leaders? And I'm actually going to be sharing some ways that you can train up young worship leaders in next week's video. But for now, I want to lay the groundwork for why you should be training up young worship leaders. And really, we should be training up worship leaders of all ages. But today I just wanted to focus in on this idea of specifically training up young worship leaders. So let's get into it, because the first reason is this. This is why you should be training up young worship leaders. Number one is that chances are that's how you were taught to lead worship. And maybe if that's not your story, just know that that's the story of a lot of worship leaders in the church, that they started off when they were young, when they were students, and they were asked to join the worship team. And that's actually my story. I'll just share a little bit of my story so you can see. And this is not just a unique story. This is a story that happens all over the church every day. My story goes like this. At the age of 13, my family had started a contemporary worship service at our church, and my entire family led worship. My mom played keyboard, my dad and my sister sang, my brother played bass, and I was left out in the chairs just watching. I'd come to practice with them, but I didn't know how to play an instrument or anything. And so I did that for 6 months, a year maybe, until one day my dad finally came home with an acoustic guitar. It wasn't for my birthday, it wasn't for anything special, just randomly got an acoustic guitar for me. And I picked it up and I started to learn. And next thing I know, I was asked to join the worship team. And I learned a lot through those 2 or 3 years of playing on the worship team until eventually I turned 16. And this is where the idea of this is how I was taught really takes form. Because when I was 16, the current leader of our worship team left the team, stepped down from their position, and people came to me as a 16-year-old and said, hey, can you be in charge of the worship team? Can you be the, oops, I just hit my mic. Can you be the praise team coordinator? And reluctantly, I said yes. I didn't know what I was doing, but I grew up and I learned at the age of 16, and then eventually I became a full-time worship leader. And the purpose of training up young worship leaders isn't even that they would become full-time worship leaders as their job. It's just so that they can serve the church. So the number one reason is for training up young worship leaders is because that's a lot of your stories. And even if there wasn't like contemporary worship leaders around whenever you were growing up, you probably served in some musical capacity in the church. Maybe you sang in the choir or something like that led you to become interested and even set the groundwork for you to lead worship like you are today. So the number one reason that you should be training up new young worship leaders is because that's probably your story. You can see the effects if you looked back on your childhood of serving in the church. On to number 2, the second reason that you should be training up young worship leaders is simply that they are the future of the church. They are who is going to be leading the church 30 years from now. And so you can definitely train up people beside you, train up people your same age, but they're going to be leading alongside you. And we want to train up those people, but we also want to train up the people behind us, the younger people, so that when we aren't leading anymore, when we're gone, or whenever we have other things going on and we're 92 and we aren't leading worship anymore, we still want to make sure that the church has worship leaders. So that's why it's so important that we train not just the people beside us, the people our same age or the people who are a little bit older than us, but we want to be training those younger people so that when we aren't around anymore, there's still people around to lead the church. Number 3, and this is big for me because I've seen it a lot, and I know that this is true in my life as well. Number 3 is that church engagement leads to church retention. Church engagement leads to church retention. And what I mean by that is the more involved somebody is in the church, the more likely they are to stay in the church. And we hear it all the time that young people are leaving the church at record numbers, and I think some of that is hyperbolic, but it is true. You'll see that story oftentimes where young people go to college or they get of college age and all of a sudden they aren't interested in the church anymore. But the truth is, if you can get them interested, and not just interested, but plugged in and engaged in the church, and you don't treat them like second-class citizens of the church who they just have their little part over here and everything else is separate. If you can plug them into the main body of the church, which is what we should be doing anyways, then that engagement will lead to retention. So whenever they leave your church and go to college or maybe even go to another church, they're still plugged in at a church because they have that foundation of being connected and understanding that it is their responsibility to not just show up to church, but to be engaged and involved in serving the church. So church engagement leads to church retention, and that's just reflecting on my own experience and what I've seen plenty of times before. The more engaged somebody is in the church, the more likely they are to stay involved in the church. And for me, that took place. Once again, I was asked to be the worship leader at age 16. Shortly after that, I went to college, and I didn't leave the church, but I got engaged in the worship ministry on my college campus. And then from there, I came back home and stayed engaged in the church because I had a reason to be involved. I wasn't treated like a second-class citizen of the church the entire time I grew up in the church, but I was actively involved because people like you have the opportunity to do, to the young people in your church, asked me, and you can ask them to be engaged in your church. On to number 4. The 4th reason that you should be training up young worship leaders in your church is that it's part of your job description. Ephesians 4:12 says that we are to equip the people for the works of service or the work of ministry. And that's, once again, not just the people who are our age or the people who are older than us, it's also the people who are younger than us. And it's not just your job to just lead worship, to just lead songs on Sunday or pick out songs or even just to coordinate your team. But if you are a leader in the church, it's also your job to equip other people for the works of ministry. And sometimes, and I think this is where we get confused, sometimes that equipping doesn't lead to instant service, if that makes sense. Like, you don't just equip somebody once and the next week they're leading worship all by themselves. Equipping is a long process, especially for younger people who are also maturing in other ways as that happens. But, it could be a 2-3 year process, 5-year process, depending on when you start equipping people. But at the end of that, then, and even in the moment, they'll be able to serve the church with works of ministry. But at the end of that, maybe they'll be leading all by themselves on a Sunday morning, and that'll be an amazing thing. And that's what your job is. It's not just to sing songs on Sunday. It's not just to lead worship on Sunday, but it's to equip other people to lead worship on Sunday. And ideally, and this is what I aim for, ideally, you would get to a place where you don't even have to lead worship anymore because you have so many leaders in your church that you've raised up that you are just behind the scenes coordinating all of that. That's when you know you've done your job, when you've equipped people to do the works of ministry in your church. Not just, your job isn't to just do the work of ministry, although that is part of your job, but it's also to equip others, and that includes young people, to do the work of ministry in your church. Which leads to number 5, and the 5th reason that you should be training up young worship leaders in your church is that there is honestly no better feeling than to step back from leading worship and just be out with the rest of your church and watch the people that you have trained up lead worship all by themselves. There's nothing better than that feeling, to know that you've done your job of equipping people to lead worship and do the works of ministry, and you just get to step back and watch those young people that you've been pouring into for 3 or 4 or 5 or however many years, just watching them lead worship. Even, now that I think about it, even if you don't give them full control, like they aren't leading an entire service by themselves, there's really no better feeling than to identify a young person who has the potential and capability to lead worship on stage, and you give them just one song on Sunday. And no longer is it just you leading every song in the set, but you say, hey, I want you to lead this song. And then you step back, and maybe you're singing background vocals, or maybe you're just playing your instrument, your keyboard or your guitar, and you just get to watch them lead and know that they have been working at this for a really long time, and now they're doing an amazing job. So those are the 5 reasons that you should be training up new worship leaders in your church. Next week, I'm going to share with you how you can actually train up young worship leaders in your church. But before you go, I just wanted to share with you this free audio training that I put together. It's called 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading. And in this audio training, I share with you 5 simple tips that if you're just aware of them and make the conscious effort to apply them to your worship leading, they will improve your worship leading. So thanks so much for joining me today. Once again, my name is Spencer Cormany from leadingworshipwell.com, and I'll catch you in the next one, guys. Keep leading worship well.